A bit louder. Can we turn it up a tiny bit? Yeah, there we go. Perhaps that's a bit better. And no, it's not. It's not a bit better.
Yeah.
Right, is that better? Now, what about the dimness of the lights? Down a bit, down a bit. The most... He's going upstairs to turn it off. Better? Better? Okay. Right. Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's no introduction, so I'm going straight into the lecture, and we shall begin with the two collectors that we're discussing in the next three lectures. And here on the left-hand side, you can see Morozov, and on the right-hand side, Shchukin. And there are two men with a great deal in common. They were both from families of old believers. The old believers were a rather conservative sect of the Russian Orthodox Church. Not that that really affected them so much, except that Shchukin was always very averse to buying nudes because he thought this would horrify his family. But they also came from a strata of society in Moscow. They were both Muscovites, they were both born in Moscow. And the strata of society was known as the merchant class. And it was a specific class of people who largely controlled the industries of Russia. And through the 19th century, gradually Russia begins to expand economically, and so also exponentially these two men become incredibly rich, as do many, many others of the merchant class. The merchant class who dominate the various industries, mining, railways, import-export, tea, coffee, whatever. And in this instance, they both had fortunes derived from textiles. And interestingly, one of the incentives for the rise of the economic development in Russia in the 19th century was the emancipation of the serfs. The serfs were given their freedom in 1861 by Alexander II. And Morozov's grandfather was actually a serf. So you came from literally rags to enormous riches. And there's a wonderful story. They were enormously rich. And it came a wonderful story of one of Morozov's brothers, the chap in the bowler hat. He looks very jovial. But one of his brothers appointed an architect. He wanted to build a great home for himself, great mansion. And the architect, he said, well, sir, what style do you want it in? He said, I'm so rich, I want it in all the styles. And the building still survives in Moscow, by the way. It's a weird sort of Gothic Moorish building. But anyway, they were men of enormous wealth. And by the late 19th century, in the 1890s into the 1900s, they both go to Paris. They didn't work in tandem. They didn't work together. They worked totally separately. But they were aware of each other. They were friends with each other. But they went to Paris and began collecting Parisian French, Western art, exclusively. And they both came from commercial backgrounds. They didn't, either of them, have any great artistic education, although they grew up in a very intellectual environment. But it is extraordinary. And what happens eventually is that with the revolution, their textile mills, their possessions, their buildings, their family homes are all nationalized. And the merchant class is utterly obliterated by Lenin. Then their homes are made into museums initially. But by after the end of the Second World War in the 1940s, there is discussions amongst the Politburo, bearing in mind Stalin is still in power. And Stalin could hardly be regarded as a person that has any intellectual persuasion at all. There was moves afoot to actually distribute the collections of Morozov and Shchukin and to then destroy any of these paintings which they felt were against the principles of National Socialism, which would have meant a great deal of them. This precipitated the two directors, one of the Hermitage in Moscow, one of the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, to have a meeting where they made a cake. They put all the paintings, all 500 and plus of them, into a big bowl, scribbled them around, and then divided the cake half and half. It's a very uneven and a very silly distribution, but it's too late now to change it all. But it means that half the collection of these two men is in St. Petersburg, half is in Moscow. And it was trying to avoid Stalin and his merry men from destroying the paintings, which I think achieved its aim. So, right, we'll go on to the first illustration of Moscow. It's a large photograph taken probably about the time we're discussing, 1890s, 1900. And in fact, if you look at the colored photograph on the top left, you'll see that it's still the same Moscow River, the same bridge, and in fact the same Kremlin, which survives entirely, well, not entirely, but it survives very much as it was 120 years ago. Now, the merchant class, as I say, became increasingly rich through the 19th century, and it enabled them to found libraries, to establish newspapers, to build theatres, to support the arts in general. And one good example of this, excuse me, is a man called Tretyakov. And the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow today is, without any shadow of doubt, the finest collection of Russian paintings anywhere on earth. And Pavel Tretyakov was the founder of it, of his gallery. And as far as I can gather, there is absolutely no connection between the man who founds the gallery in Moscow and the South African artist called Vladimir Tretyakov. There's none, the man who paints those rather strange women, there's no connection at all as far as I can gather. Pavel Tretyakov was an intellect, he was a man of great sophistication, and he devoted his life to collecting Russian art. Russian art, by its own definition, means 19th century art, because prior to the 19th century, art in Russia was the icon for the church. And it's only really with the enhancement of the development in Moscow in the 19th century that Moscow can create these artists, landscapists, portraitists, and also artists who paint scenes of daily life. And just as the Dutch in the 17th century, 2 centuries before, became very, very rich very quickly, they also liked to see in their homes, hanging on their walls, scenes of everyday life, music making, jolly drinking parties, St. Nicholas celebrations, and so on. And so this is the same in Moscow. But the majority of the big merchant class would have created mansions, built magnificent homes, and then covered their walls with beautiful art of their own country, the Russian painters, except in the case of Morozov and Shukin, they chose to go to France. And just to look at one painting, the sort of painting which is in the Tretyakov Gallery today, it's a very, very famous work by probably the most high profile, the man best known in the West, the artist Ilya Repin. And here the painting is called "They Did Not Expect Him." And you can see this bedraggled man coming through the door. The door's been opened by the servants who look horrified, but the mother is in the black. She's standing up. She recognizes her son. Similarly, behind the mother, just towards the end wall, there is his wife. She's been playing the piano. She turns around. Her face shows the expression of incredible amazement. Just as the little boy, the young son on the far right, sees his father and begins to smile with pleasure. The young girl, though, the little daughter, was too young to remember her father and is horrified and terrified by this man. Now, the thing was that he's come back from Siberia. And we think of the Siberian exile as a Stalinist invention with all the gulags, where Stalin happily murdered about 10 million Russians. But it was nothing new. The idea of exiling people in Siberia was the Tsarist invention, really. And so this man obviously had been against the government, had somehow plotted his copybook, and had been sent to Siberia. The painting is dated 1880s, so it was before the telephone or the telegraph or whatever, so he couldn't inform his family. But it's the sort of work that the general Russian collector, the general merchant collector would have acquired. But there's a map here of Moscow, and the central box points to the Kremlin. The Kremlin is like the hole in the middle of a disc. The Kremlin, Moscow is a concentric city. It's built up in a series of circles surrounding the Kremlin. The Kremlin is in the middle. The Kremlin, of course, is the palace of the Tsars, if and when they come from St. Petersburg, which then was the capital, to Moscow, which was a provincial city. Now, both Morozov and Shukin, who were Muscovites, acquire homes within spitting distance, virtually, of the Kremlin. And the arrow on the left-hand side, it points to Morozov's mansion on a street called Prechestenka Street, number 21. And just down from that, I don't know if you can see it here, but just down from that, there is what is called the Pushkin Museum. That is the Museum of Fine Arts, Western art, which now houses half the collection of Morozov and Shukin. Similarly, Shukin himself lived on the Znamenska Street, living in a little alleyway called Znamenska Lane. He lives in a palace called the Trubetskoy Palace, and we'll see that tomorrow. Now, from the late 1890s, these two men, as anyone who could travel, they would travel on this newly established train from Moscow to Paris. It was established by a company called the Wagon Lit, and the Wagon Lit is still actually a quoted company on the Belgian Stock Exchange. It's a Belgian company. Its most famous railway line was the Orient Express, which went from Paris via Venice to Istanbul, what was then Constantinople. Now, you could travel now easily on a very luxurious train from Moscow, but then the blue line, which begins in Moscow, is then, you can see it here, the blue line here, and it then stops in Warsaw. Warsaw's down there. And Warsaw was then the part of the Tsarist Empire. You would stop in Warsaw because the gauge of the Russian railways is wider than the gauge in the West. So nowadays, I think you just have to click a switch and it all works perfectly. But in those days, you had to get out of the one train, all your luggage, of course, all your huge suitcases and trunks and whatever, with your hat boxes and whatever else you brought with you, would be taken off, obviously, by porters, and you'd put into a second train. And then you'd travel on to Paris. The entire journey took 52 hours, which is actually incredibly short compared to what it would have been 10 years before without any railway service at all. So it was supposedly the most luxurious line of its type in the world. And there you can see the Orient Express. It doesn't look all that impressive, you have to admit, in this photograph, but there it is chugging along with the steam coming out, the smoke pouring out from the chimney. And it was, as I say, regarded as a very, very luxurious form of travel. And here it is entering northern France en route to Paris. Now, once you got to Paris, you being Morozov or Shukin, you would then obviously seek accommodation or go to your booked accommodation in one of what was then called the first-class hotels, now five-star hotels, in the vicinity of the Palais Garnier, the Opera House of Paris. That was a sort of area where some of the smart hotels were situated, in the center of Paris. And then you would go to visit the dealers. This is where you acquired most of your paintings from, or through the dealers, through the interception of the dealers, you would acquire your paintings. And they're buying paintings by the trainload. It's not just one or two at a time. They buy hundreds of paintings, hundreds of paintings. And they are doing it within about 10 years. They don't, Morozov doesn't begin, his first acquisition is 1903, so he only has actually 10 years until the First World War begins. So it's extraordinary, their collections. Now, they would principally rely on dealerships. Now, here I'll show you 3 dealers. There were many others, but we haven't got time to discuss the dealership of Paris. And this is Paul Durand-Ruel. And he's one of the great dealers of all time, if not the greatest dealer of all time. There are biographies written of him recently. And you can see a stamp at the bottom right. It says Durand-Ruel. And originally, his showroom, his gallery, was in the Rue de la Paix. But by the time our men go in the 1890s, 1900s, he's moved to a much bigger, much grander showroom, much bigger gallery on the Rue Lafitte. It's the same area. It's still in the smart area of Paris. Now, this is painted by Renoir, and it's 1910, approximately. And it's obviously a sort of thank you letter, thank you to Durand-Ruel, because he was the first man, I think, of all time to recognize the significance of this group of young people who we now call Impressionists. And you can actually argue that without the intercession of Durand-Ruel, these young men, because they were only in their 20s, would have died of starvation because nobody was buying their paintings and they were dead poor. In fact, he does actually, he actually gives certain sort of money to people such as Monet originally so that they can paint paintings without having to worry about where the next meal was coming from. So he's a very, very significant man, Durand-Ruel. The second man is called Ambroise Vollard. And Ambroise Vollard is here painted by Cézanne, who is a post-impressionist. He's after the first great revolution of the impressionist painters. And Vollard will patronize or will promote Cézanne, Gauguin, Rousseau, and others. Ambroise Vollard is rather, I think, given a sort of tidy up by this Cézanne painting. He's shown to be a rather distinguished person, rather well-dressed. Well, normally, you can see from his photograph from the bottom right that he was a roly-poly, big, tough, rough bloke. And very unusual for a dealer, but he was the most brilliant dealer, and he promotes his stable of painters immensely well. And he's a very significant supplier of paintings to Morozov and Shukin. This painting by Cézanne is in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Paris, painted 1899. Now, the third is Kahnweiler. Kahnweiler was of German origin. He had a tiny little studio in a street called the Rue Vignon, and this is regarded today as one of the source works, one of the most important works of Picasso's Cubist period, 1910. And you can just sort of make out a face there, and that's about it, really. But it's a very interesting work, and he promotes Braque, he promotes Picasso and others. There's a label down the bottom from one of his paintings. Right, so let's begin with Morozov's collection. Morozov here buys his first paintings, as I say, bought in 1903. His first painting that he ever buys was paid by the Impressionist artist Alfred Sisley. But this is the Claude Monet, the Boulevard des Capucines, 1873, and it's in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And it shows a winter scene with that wonderful sort of harmony of the lights, the lighting, the way there's that splash of sunlight, which you can get in Northern Europe on a cold day. It's not a warm sunlight, it's just a bright splash of light until the clouds cover the sky again. And you can see that through that, the branches, leafless, of course, in winter, giving a hazy effect to the buildings behind, whereas in contrast, there's that shadow with the people who are promenading. It probably must be a Saturday or a Sunday, promenading on the boulevard. The Boulevard des Capucines, which is painted in 1873. Monet's very, very useful to us because he signs and dates all his paintings, which is very thoughtful of him. He paints this painting in 73, 1 year before the Impressionist exhibition. The Impressionist exhibition was held in 1874, and at that first exhibition, there were 6 Impressionist exhibitions. At that first exhibition, there was Monet, of course, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and others of their circle. And this painting, as you can see here, there's that wonderful sort of cut-off. It's like a photograph with those 2 men in bowler hats on the right-hand side. That they don't need to be shown in their entirety. It's just a reference. It's an impression of what is going on. And you can see that they're on a balcony. They're leaning over the balcony, looking at the people promenading. But this painting, which is a typical source work of Monet's oeuvre, it's a painting that is painted from a room overlooking the Boulevard des Capucines, and it's in that room that the first Impressionist exhibition was held. And one of the paintings in that first Impressionist exhibition is this one, is that one there. So you can't get better than that. And it is one of a series of Monets, and you can see here the haystacks. Monet will paint these succession of paintings of one single theme, and the first time he does this is painting haystacks near to his house at Giverny. Now, Giverny is bought by Monet in 1883. In 1883, Monet moves out of Paris and goes to live in Normandy. And if you draw a line from Paris to the northwest of Paris, if you draw a line going up to the English Channel, you get to Rouen. And halfway before you get to Rouen is Giverny. So it's Paris, Giverny, Rouen in that line that you have leading northwest. Now, he will go from his... And Giverny then was a small house with a small plot of land. It was a modest structure, but by now, it shows that by 1883, he's making money. Durand-Ruel is actually managing to promote his art so that people are beginning to buy it. And so he's getting enough money, but he can't, as yet, have a big amount of land around his property. And so he will just walk down the lane and paint the field of the local farmer. And there he paints this haystack. It's a haystack which is in shadow. They've got the splash of light behind again. It's probably a sort of bright June day. And there again, the leaves on the trees, they're almost sparkling and rustling. You can always hear them. It's got that sort of contrast of light and shade in this painting. And Monet will paint a series of these. He'll paint 25 haystacks. And Durand-Ruel will, in 1891, which is the year, the cut-off point when he stops painting haystacks, is that in 1891, Durand-Ruel, the dealer, will have an exhibition entirely of the haystacks. 15 haystacks are shown by Durand-Ruel, and every single one is sold. And that shows that Monet, but by now, 20 years on from the first Impressionists, from the first attempts by the Impressionists to make a mark on the art world, they are beginning to do quite well. And here you can see a series of haystacks of the 25 that he paints. And they're usually they're dotted around the world today. Sometimes at a big exhibition, some are reassembled and you can see them together. But generally they're now dotted around the world in various museums. Now the middle one at the top line, is the first of his haystacks. It's Haystack at Giverny, which is purchased by Shukin. I'm popping it in here because it'll save time tomorrow. And it shows a much more sophisticated approach to his paintings than some of the others. Here you see you see the little haystack, you see the fields which have sort of been rain-washed. Summer showers just come over. And there that you feel it's that clarity of light, which also illuminates the house, the farmhouse. And then beyond that, you can see the haziness of the shower going beyond to the distant horizon. And it's a much more sort of cerebral painting than the others, really. And this is purchased by Shukin. We'll see his works tomorrow, see his art tomorrow. It's in the Hermitage Museum. Now, another of the series that Monet does, he does 4 series, and we'll touch on all of them, but this is the series of the London fog, London smog, basically. And it's called Waterloo Bridge, Effects of the Fog. Now, this is in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And you will find that Monet will go to London on 3 successive years, 1899, 1900, 1901. And during those 3 years, he'll go in autumn, he'll go in September, because then the smog has that filtered light, and it's at its sort of most intense at that time. And there he'll paint Waterloo Bridge. You can see the arches of the bridge, 5 arches going across the Thames. You can see the chimneys on the south bank of the Thames belching smoke, creating all this smog. You can see 2 little boats, 2 little rowing boats on the Thames. And it's dated 1903. Well, he wasn't in London in 1903. Most confusingly here, he then will paint, and we have reference to this by the British artist Sickert, who goes to visit Monet in the Savoy Hotel where he's staying. And apparently he says there's canvases everywhere. 90 canvases, he said. That might be an exaggeration, but lots and lots and lots of canvases. That he'll start a painting, and then what he'll do is finish it, to his satisfaction, that is. He'll finish it back in Giverny when he gets back, and which is the date when he finishes it, 1903. But he was in London from 1899, 1900, 1901. Now, you can see here the bridge that he paints. There is Waterloo Bridge, as it was. Brick built. It's designed by a very famous Scottish engineer called John Rennie. But the present bridge, because there the aerial photograph shows the Charing Cross, the Waterloo Bridge, the top one. That's Waterloo Bridge. But if you go to London now, you'll see a very different shape of bridge. It's got rather sort of sophisticated spans, much bigger arches. And it was built after the Second World War, because this bridge, the brick bridge, was sinking by then into the slush of the Thames. Now, what he does is stay at the Savoy Hotel, where the arrow points there, and in the morning he'll paint Waterloo Bridge, because that's when the light is best. Then he'll begin clockwise to turn round. He'll turn and paint Charing Cross Bridge, and then finally in the afternoon light he'll paint the Houses of Parliament, which are down here. He doesn't paint Westminster Bridge, but he paints the Houses of Parliament. Now, it has been worked out on the computer that he stayed in the Savoy. That is the Savoy as it was then, and it hasn't changed very much. It still looks very similar from the outside. And he would have stayed either in 1610, 1611, 1510, 1511. Those are the room numbers on the topmost floors of the Savoy. But what fascinates me is that how did he manage to stay in the Savoy for months on end? I mean, it's one of the most expensive places on earth. I mean, seriously, you couldn't do that now unless you'd been involved in serious state capture. I mean, there's no other way. But anyway, he did, and he produces this huge series of London paintings. Whether they were 90 or not, I think is questionable, but there are a great many of them. Now, just to look at another one, which was purchased by Shukin. It's of the Houses of Parliament. You can see Big Ben there, now called the Elizabeth Tower. And it's called, the title of it, because he paints about 19 paintings of the Houses of Parliament. And so this one's called The Seagulls. You can see a few seagulls in the sky. There's a big flock of them in the foreground, which you may not make out. And this is purchased by Shukin. Now, back to Paris and back to a different artist. And here we can see in Montmartre a structure called Le Moulin de la Galette. And it means the windmill of the galette. A galette is a piece of cake. It's a bun. It's something you eat. Le Moulin de la Galette. And it was established by a family. It was an outdoor cafe bar area. And you can see the entrance here. Oh, sorry, you can see the entrance here. Moulin Galette. And there you can see the same entrance up there with a rather smart restaurant now. Now, the Moulin de la Galette was a very popular meeting place for the young aspirant artists who were congregated in the vicinity of Montmartre. And you can see that there were two windmills in the 1880s. There's now one reconstructed windmill for tourist purposes. But here you can see the painting, which is acquired by Morozov. And it is a Renoir, and it is this wonderful sense of the light and shade of the trees, the leaves, the leafage, the natural quality, the natural light. And then you've got, coming in on the left, is the girl in a white and blue striped gown, and she's called Nini Lopez, and she was a model. She was part of the sort of circle of the young Impressionist painters. They're all still in their late 20s, early 30s by now, in 1875. And it's called Under the Arbor at the Moulin de la Galette. Now, just to confuse you, I am showing at the bottom right a painting that has absolutely nothing to do with Morozov and Shukin, I'm afraid. But is, however, one of Renoir's most famous paintings, one of his most important paintings, and it's called The Ball at the Moulin de la Galette. And you can see Nini, this is a year later, and you can see Nini sitting there. She's wearing the same dress, I'm afraid. But there you can see her. And but in the actual painting owned by Morozov, Under the Arbor, she's coming in, and the chap there with a boater hat on and his beard is Monet. Normally we think of Monet as with his big white beard looking like Father Christmas. But there he is, of course, as a young man. He had to be young at some stage, and there he is as a young man, and part of this circle. And then it has been suggested, queried, that the chap in the hat over there is Sisley, Alfred Sisley. Excuse me. So why I'm showing you the fact is that the painting acquired by Morozov, now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, is the forerunner. It's the sort of experimental early development of what will be the next year's painting, which is the famous ball scene, the dance. It's not a ball at all, but it's a dance. And you can see the figures circling the lovely group of young at their tables at the bottom right, and the whole thing with the dappled light of the gas lamps that are lighting the square, the bar area, the cafe area. Right, so let's move on. Now, we're looking at a room which is in Morozov's house, number 21 Prechestenka Street. And by 1918, 1919, their houses have been nationalized. Their collections have been nationalized. And so therefore they don't own anything anymore. And in 1921, Morozov will die. He will be taking the waters at Carlsbad, which is now in the Czech Republic. It's a spa town. It's a rather nice little town. And he's taking the waters there. And I think Morozov was a real sort of gourmet man. I mean, he loved his champagne. He loved his foie gras. He loved sort of entertaining. He was a jolly fellow. He had a good time in life. And I think he just died from excess, basically. But anyway, he was in Carlsbad. He had been allowed to leave. And he obviously left with a great, by then, you don't become a billionaire without being slightly clever. So, I mean, he would have transferred his money outside Russia by then, as did Shukin. Shukin, we definitely know, transferred all his wealth, all his income, all his sort of portable wealth to a Swedish bank before he left. But anyway, Morozov did leave quite legally. Shukin actually has to flee, but Morozov is allowed to leave in 1919, but then dies in 1921 in Carlsbad. So by now we're looking at what is his museum. It now has a curator and it's open to the public. And you can see 12 paintings rather by Cézanne. Here we can see them in colour. The end wall shows very early Cézanne. Cézanne is born in 1839. These are dated in the 1860s, so he's still a young man. He's still in his late 20s. And there again you've got a self-portrait of Cézanne on the wall. These are landscapes. That's a still life, more landscapes. I'll show you the most famous, the most important. That is the smoker. That is the still life. And that is Madame Cézanne. Cézanne, who, of course, is a post-impressionist. He has no sense of the sort of quality of light that he's painting. He's much more interested in colour. He's much more interested in sort of flat surfaces. And here we can see the smoker. The smoker's up on the top right-hand side, and there on the bottom left-hand side is a photograph. The photograph is taken by the dealer, Ambroise Vollard. Ambroise Vollard, who was promoting Cézanne and Gauguin. Now, again, you can't find a better provenance than actually a photograph taken in 1904 of the Autumn Salon, of the room which was created by Vollard, of the Cézanne room. And there he's exhibiting the paintings. And there you can see the smoker. And then also the arrow points to another painting, also in the possession of Morozov originally, which is the bottom right rather. And it's of the bathers, and Cézanne was painting a series of these paintings. He was trying to sort of establish some sort of artistic connection between man and nature. That you've got the naturalist with the sort of the simplicity of the nature, the beauty of the nature, with the simplicity of the nude figures in these paintings. They're usually of nude men, and both these paintings were in Morozov's collection. And here you can see the smoker again. It's 1890s, early 1890s. 1890s is Cézanne's great decade. He paints some of his greatest works, or all of his greatest works, in the 1890s. He dies eventually in 1906. The smoker here is in the Hermitage, and always painting in the south of France. It could have been somebody in his local village, somebody he's met, somebody he knows from the bar in his local town. And he's now posing for Cézanne. You can see there this wonderful balance and calm, this dignity of this man. And then in the background, you can see here there's a wine bottle, there's a jar, and there are 3 pieces of fruit. And there on the bottom right, you can see a wine jar, a wine bottle, a jar, and 3 pieces of fruit. And it's in the painting because you can see that it's an unfinished work. And it's unframed. And he's obviously sitting in Cézanne's studio with other paintings on the wall, which we can't identify. And there is this wonderful image of the sort of stability of life at that time, and with this chap who's perfectly satisfied with his condition. And there he is sort of posing for Cézanne in his studio. And similarly now, this still life. This is indisputably the greatest still life Cézanne painted. He painted a number of still lifes. But here is his still life again of the 1890s, approximately 1895. It's in the Hermitage again. And you can almost feel the weight of that curtain here. It's sort of obviously very heavy material, a cumbersome material. And there again, that jug has a wonderful tactile quality. You want to pick it up. And then again, this superb light, where the light is now moulding this scene. It's unfinished. The napkin on the right-hand side it needs a bit more work done to it, But then I think it's probably finished to Cézanne's satisfaction. And it's his most famous still life, purchased again by Morozov. What Morozov did is he would always, he's not a billionaire by being stupid, and so he would have advisors, and one of his advisors actually was an artist, a recognized artist still today, called Maurice Denis. And in the early 1900s, Maurice Denis would very often accompany Morozov on these visits, probably also with one of his children or perhaps a friend or relation. There'd be a little entourage. And he would go in, and Maurice Denis and his other advisors would say, well, I think we should look at that one. That's a very good painting there. That's probably a better one there, and so on. And Morozov will then choose them. And then rather like, it doesn't apply anymore because of the internet, but in the old days when you went to a cathedral or went to a museum on your travels somewhere, you will then go to the shop afterwards and buy a few postcards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and pick them up and go to the till and pay 10 euros or so. And it's the same. Morozov was just the same, but he was now buying paintings like we buy postcards. He said, yes, now I'll buy that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. I'm staying at the hotel, whatever. Send me the bill. Ship them to Moscow, and I'm now going to lunch. And he'd walk out of the room. So this is what he did. But he always had, what is so exceptionally interesting is these two men were not just buying tat. They were buying some of the best paintings of the period, some of the best paintings of the time. And they had this instinctive eye to do this. And this particularly applies to Shukin tomorrow, but we'll discuss that later. Now, there's Madame Cézanne, Marie Hortense, and she lived with him out of wedlock, producing a child, and then they marry in 1886, the year that Cézanne's father dies. Cézanne and his father had a very spiky relationship, but obviously in French law, the children must inherit the estate. So Cézanne was an only child and inherited the estate. So that is Marie Hortense in the conservatory of the family home in Provence. And it happens to be in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Well, why is it there? And why isn't it in the Pushkin or the Hermitage? And the reason is that after the revolution, when in the 1920s they try and institute these 5-year plans, they find they've actually got no money. So it's very difficult to institute the plans. So what they do to begin with is sell, well, they sell the treasures they've nationalized, and they sell a great deal, not all, but they sell a great deal of the Fabergé. They sell many to the inestimable loss of Russia, They sell paintings from the Hermitage, many of them. And today, the very nucleus, the very foundation of the National Gallery of Art in Washington is from these paintings bought by Andrew Mellon, and once in the Hermitage Museum. And so then they start selling the collection of Morozov. They only managed to sell 2. Because there wasn't that much interest. We had early 1920s. The French School of Art was not then as recognized as it would become later in the 1930s, and obviously onwards from there. But the second thing is that they are aware that there are lawyers sort of hovering in the background, because the lawyers are there hoping that there'll be sales, more sales, and then they'll plunge in and claim these paintings for the heirs of Shukin and Morozov. And so they stop immediately, and they don't do that. And this is one of the paintings. The other one is a Van Gogh, which I'll show you now. This again is from Prechestenka Street, the museum which is now called the Museum of Modern Western Paintings No. 2. But it doesn't apply now. It was now in the 1920s. The Museum of Modern Western Paintings No. 2. And there are 6 Van Goghs, which was a particular favorite of Morozov. And here you can see them in color. And I'm looking at the bottom, or considering first the bottom painting, which is called The Night Café. And The Night Café is in Arles. Vincent van Gogh was, at this time in 1888, he was in Arles, the town in the south of France, which then was a small little village. And there was in the town a cafe that stayed open all night. So it obviously attracted down and outs, drunks and whatever. And this appealed to Van Gogh enormously. Gauguin hated it. But the reason why there are these two paintings together, and it's such a shame they're now separated, is that Van Gogh had staying with him at that time Paul Gauguin. Gauguin had been encouraged to stay with Van Gogh by Van Gogh's brother Theo. And it was really to try and sort of get some sort of artistic community going. Anyway, it was never going to last because these two men were so strange in their own rights. I mean, Van Gogh was a very disturbed man, as we know. Gauguin was the most self-opinionated man you've ever come across. And it was a clash of personalities which was going to happen. But there you can see the night cafe painted by Van Gogh, now today in Yale University because it was sold by the Russians. And it has this turbulence, it has this anxiety, it has this extraordinary sort of passion which you find in Van Gogh. The way the floorboards sort of rush towards you, the way the lights are pulsating in the background. There's the green of the billiard table, which is sort of, again, electric. Whereas in Gauguin's representation of this same scene, because they're living together, they're staying together at this stage, Gauguin's painting a much more calm, balanced painting called the Café at Arles, and it's in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow today. And you can see that. You can see there's a chap sleeping off the night before. That's the local postman in Arles. And those three ladies in the background are supposedly prostitutes. The one's got there's white little things, curlers in her hair. And there Gauguin is painting Madame Ginoux. Monsieur Ginoux is next to the table in Van Gogh's painting. And Madame Ginoux, I think, was the power behind the throne. And there she is, seated, beautifully calm, balanced, this wonderful splash of colour. He adores colour, Gauguin. And there you see her looking very critically at Gauguin, because Gauguin apparently he recorded the fact that he said to Madame Ginoux when he was painting this painting, Madame Ginoux, this painting will be in the Louvre one day and you'll be world famous. And she's looking at him saying, pull the other one, don't be so crazy. Instead of which she is world famous. I mean, she's not in the Louvre, but she's she's a very famous figure because of the fact Gauguin painted her. And it shows the contrast of these two men's personality. Now, at the same time, Van Gogh will paint this painting called the Red Venus. All these paintings are purchased by Morozov. And it is in the Pushkin Museum of Moscow. It's called the Red Vineyard, where he writes to one of his correspondents, a man called Eugene Boch, B-O-C-H. And he says, I've just painted this painting. It's got this brilliant yellow. It's got the yellow of the sun. It's got the red of the leaves because, of course, it's autumn. Gauguin and Van Gogh are working together in Arles in the September, October time, November time. And it's the autumn colours of the leaves of the vines, and then the blue of the uniforms of the workers. And it's again dramatic, it's disturbing. The sun somehow seems to would sort of eat into you with its rays. And what is extraordinary is that this painting is the only painting that Van Gogh ever sold. And it was bought by Anna Boch, the sister of Eugene Boch, to whom he wrote about this painting. And Anna Boch paid 400 francs for it. Now, that obviously means absolutely nothing to us today. We have no, it's a figure that means nothing. But on the internet, which of course, as we know, is not all that reliable all the time, but there is an article about the value of currencies, or not article, a sort of section, and it has been suggested that if you multiply the French franc of the late 1890s, 1900, by 6, you get to a very approximate estimate of what it would be in euros now. So 400 times 6 comes to 2,400 euros. So it's very little money. But he was unknown, he was untrusted, untested, he hadn't sold a painting before, so it was better than not. And what is really rather tragic is that Morozov buys this painting after Van Gogh has died. He buys it through the dealer Vollard, and he'll pay 10,000 francs for it, and that'll be 60,000 euros, which is quite a bit of money. And it would have made such a difference to Van Gogh's sort of whole attitude to his paintings, I think. Anyway, what happens there, instead of which, there is this fallout between the two of them. They have an unholy fight, verbal fight, after which Van Gogh tries to attack Gauguin with a knife. Gauguin then just goes straight back to Paris, abandons all this project that he thought of staying with Van Gogh. And I don't think that Gauguin would have bothered about it. He probably woke up the next day and hadn't even any memory of what had happened. He was always moi. I mean, he was always the man, he was always think of himself. But Van Gogh was in turmoil, poor man. And that's when he cuts off his ear and he paints himself in that bandage. And his brother, as usual, poor old Theo, comes to pick up the pieces, and he is encouraged to go into a psychiatric hospital, which he does in Provence, in Saint-Rémy. The hospital actually still survives. You can go and see the room which Van Gogh painted, the room that he lived in. He, during that period of time, he's there for a year. And eventually, in May 1890, he's regarded as being sufficiently sort of stabilized to be able to be left to his own devices and to go back into the community. And at the same time, though, he paints this painting, again purchased by Morozov. The painting is on the left. The right-hand side shows you the engraving that is copied by Van Gogh. It's an engraving by Gustave Doré, who of course is French, and he made a series, he published a book called London, A Pilgrimage, and that book contains a whole series of low-life scenes, the life of the squalor of the slums of London, not the grand avenues, the grand boulevards, or whatever, the carriages and so on. And this is a scene from a prison, and you can see that Van Gogh is copying it exactly, the engraving, but it's a cry for help. And I don't know why the hospital didn't take it up, but I suppose they just sort of thought he was just an amateur painter. But anyway, it shows the intensity. There's also claustrophobic atmosphere you've got there. You always feel the walls are coming in on you, and there's hardly any, well, there is light, but it's too far away to even recognize. And poor old Van Gogh then is released, and he goes to stay in a town called Auvers. Auvers. Auvers is north of Paris, but it's close enough to Paris that Van Gogh can get to Paris because that's where his brother Theo lives. And in the space of 2 months, he'll paint 70 paintings, including these two, which are both purchased by Morozov from Vollard, the dealer. And the left-hand one, Cottages at Auvers, which is the Hermitage, shows the turbulence of his mind. I mean, the land it's not like an earthquake. The land is rippling, it's moving, it's got a very sort of unstable feeling. Whereas, in fact, that landscape on the right-hand side, which is in the Pushkin Museum, is far more balanced and calm and relaxed. It's a lovely, lovely painting of the environment at the time. But then one day he goes out, as he did every day. He rents a room in Auvers. He goes out every day with his easel, with his paints, and one day he takes a pistol with him and commits suicide, which is all very, very sad. But, and as I say, the only painting he ever painted happens to be, ironically, in Morozov's collection. So there is Morozov's mansion, where he would have displayed his paintings. Praetor Street, number 21, which is now the Academy of Fine Arts. Now, there's no entrance on the main street, which is probably quite sensible, because you don't want all the dirt and the dust and the muck coming in your front door. But you go round to the back. Go round to the back, and there's a great courtyard, and then there'll be an entrance leading up on the left. You'll go up that entrance, and as you rise up to the first floor landing, the intermediary landing rather, you'll see this painting. It's 12 meters across and 4.5 meters high. and it's of this amazing scene of summer in the Mediterranean. It's called On the Mediterranean, 1911. It's painted specifically by Pierre Bonnard for that position, and it's now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Bonnard, who was very much a man of colour. He loved painting colours, part of the sort of school that he was involved with. And he paints nature here, this nature which is overwhelming, the grandeur of nature. These little figures, there's a little figure on the far left, a little figure on the far right of the painting, that is. And this nature sort of has this wonderful magnificence. And there you can see, in the distance there is the Mediterranean. And then there's a tree trunk there, and that tree trunk is there in the painting. Now, then you get to the first landing, and then you've got another flight of stairs to go up to the first floor.